My name is Chris Harwood. I'm president of the New York chapter of SVU, the Czechoslovak Society of Arts and Sciences, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the first program, at least that I've introduced this fall. So just a few general words before I introduce our guest this evening. I would like to thank our principal sponsors, the Bohemian Benevolent and Literary Association, which makes everything we do possible, and also the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which for a number of years now has generously supported, especially our efforts to record and put online our programming so that if you miss anything, you can go check out our YouTube channel and catch up. And we're also very grateful for all of you who individually donate your funds or your time to help us along. And we encourage you to follow us online, check out our website, our Facebook page, and especially that YouTube channel if you want to catch up on other things we've done recently. Our speakers today, our principal speaker, our author this evening is Daniela Grollová Spenser, who was born in Prague and then emigrated to England in 1968 after the Soviet-led invasion of Czechoslovakia. And not long after that, she moved on in 1972 to Mexico. She studied Spanish and Latin American literature at King's College London and anthropology at the London School of Economics. She earned an MA in Latin American Studies in Mexico and a PhD in history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She joined the research center, Centro de Investigaciones y Estudios superiores en Antropología Social in Mexico City in 1980. Her areas of study have been Mexican and Latin American social and political history, as well as the history of communism and the Cold War. She is the author of The Impossible Triangle: Mexico, Soviet Russia, and the US during the 1920s. That came out with Duke University Press in 1999. And she's also editor, along with Gilbert Joseph, of In From the Cold, Latin America's New Encounter with the Cold War, also from Duke in 2008. In 2018, she published the biography of a Mexican labor leader, and that came out first in Spanish as En combate, la vida de Lombardo Toledano, with Penguin Random House. And the English version came out in 2020. That was In Combat, the Life of Lombardo Toledano. And in this illustrious career along the way, she received the John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship in 2007. And so Daniela is going to present a book which I've really been looking forward to, and when I heard about the opportunity to have her presented here, I was very excited because one of the central things that we do at SVU is to kind of help connect the Czech and Slovak diasporas, and we're especially good at the part that's based in the New York area, but it's always a thrill when we can connect with parts of this diaspora that ended up elsewhere, and so I'm fascinated to hear more about the story that Daniela is going to tell us about. And after presenting the book, she's going to enter into conversation with her colleague, Dan La Botz, who is a retired professor, taught most recently at the School of Urban and Labor Studies at the City University of New York. He's also the author of a dozen books, including both historical works and novels, and he's a member of the editorial board of the journal New Politics. Among his most recent books are Riding with the Revolution, The American Left in the Mexican Revolution, 1900 and 1925, and Radioactive Radicals, a novel of labor and the left. And so with that, please welcome our author, Daniela Grollová Spenser. Use this one if you want to wander. You can.
In the first place, I'd like to thank you all for coming here. It was very important to me to present the book in New York because even though the book doesn't take place here, much of it does take place in England and of course in Czechoslovakia. I wanted to present it in New York very much. I also wanted to thank the Czechoslovak Czechoslovak organization, not Czech and Slovak, but Czechoslovak, because whenever I'm asked, I am Czechoslovak. I wanted to thank you also for organizing the event, and I wanted to thank my former mentor for being here, because he taught me the art of history. The reason why I want to start with the cover of the three books, the same book but addressing different audiences, because I want to show what is my identity. My identity is Czech, is English, and is Mexican. And it is not just to show different covers, but I am talking to different audiences. And that's why it was very important to me that the book would come almost simultaneously in the three languages. I want to present the main protagonists of the book. My grandfather, Wilhelm Ornstein, from the Sudetenland. My grandmother, Anna Ungarová, from Poland, Przemysl. My mother, Ruth Ornsteinová, born in Przemysl, but just incidentally, grew up in Teplice and then in Prague. My father, Kurt Groll, born in Moravia and Valašské Meziříčí, lived most of his time in Prague. And Vladimír Tosek, my mother's second husband. I start the book with the demise of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the demise of democracy in Czechoslovakia, and my grandfather's decision to leave for the unknown. They moved to Britain, emigrated in a clandestine way, and arrived in England, where my mother grew up until she was old enough to join the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, where she became a sergeant of the Royal Air Force. As such, and speaking perfect German, she was recruited as a secret interpreter of German commands of German pilots, which allowed her to interpret those commands and pass them on to the British pilots. Here she describes what she did.
At Kingsdown Hall in Kent, the enemy ground-to-air radio traffic was monitored 24 hours a day by German-speaking WAFs. Behind the hall, a Nissen hut still stands. It was from here that Operation Corona was conducted. WAFs who spoke perfect German posed as the Luftwaffe night fighter controllers, giving them false instructions and orders.
On one particular day, I was doing this, and I was given a plane. Incidentally, the German girls on the other side, they would of course react to this because they would hear this, and they would hear that there was another so-called enemy voice on the same frequency, and they would say, "This is eine Feindstimme, this is an enemy voice, don't listen to it, don't listen to it." And we again would say, "Wir sind die echte Stimme, we are the real voice, listen to us." So much so that in the end the pilot was completely confused and didn't know who was who. But on that one occasion, there was one Junkers 88 flying over the channel, and I was given the exact course and height to lead him over the Isle of Wight, which I did. I kept on saying, fliegen Sie Hani 18, Caruso 26, things like that. And then suddenly I lost touch with him, and that was that. And then a couple of hours later, I was told that the ACAC station over the Isle of Wight got him down.
So this 19-year-old woman helped to bring down a German airplane. And one of the themes of the book is that the Second World War empowered women, emancipated them, which to the displeasure of men after the Second World War. In the second part of the book, I talk about my grandmother and her going through the concentration camps, which I shall not talk about. But what I discovered during my research was something about my father. I had no idea that he left Czechoslovakia for Palestine, became a prisoner of war, and then returned in a harrowing journey through Germany, England, to Palestine in 1945. Here I want to describe the journey on the river Danube from Bratislava to Sulina, it was the only way to leave in 1939 from Czechoslovakia when all the borders were closed, but of course a river has no borders. From Sulina, he traveled to Haifa via Turkey on a ship which was intercepted by the British. The British detained the 2,300 refugees and had held them for 4 months. After the 4 months, my father joined the British Army, was taken to Greece, and in Greece was taken prisoner of war by the Germans. In the British archives, I found this document which registers my father as Palestinian, Jewish, British prisoner of war, and what on the other side is all the working camps in which he was forced to work for German industrialists, a simple document which tells a whole story. He was there for 4 years, and in 1941, the Germans wanted to show how well they treated their prisoners and had given them, just for the show, nice uniforms and boots. And these photographs were to be sent to their families and, of course, shown around the world about the good German treatment of their prisoners of war. In 1945, the prisoners were forced to leave on foot 700 kilometers, 500 miles to Germany, which they did. I haven't found any photographs of my father, all of these come from the internet. He arrived in 1946, and so did my mother. In December 1946, they got married. On the left, on the one side of my mother is my grandmother, the one that had survived Terezín, Auschwitz, Hamburg, and Bergen-Belsen. Next to her is Kurt, my father. Next to him is his sister, who survived Terezín. Next to her, her husband, who survived Terezín, Auschwitz, and Dachau. For them, as I describe in great detail in the book, the 50s were deadly. Read the book, I'll tell you all about it in the book. My mother was working for the Czechoslovak television. She divorced my father 2 years after they were married and met this young journalist, Vladimír Tosek, a supremely intelligent man and a great linguist, whom she married in 1967 after he got his divorce. On the photo is my mother beaming, Vladimir, his older son, my grandmother, and closest friends. Vladimir became a famous Czechoslovak journalist in the 1960s, and he interviewed all kinds of famous people, including Che Guevara, when he arrived in Czechoslovakia to buy tractors. In Cuba, he interviewed Fidel Castro. In Czechoslovakia, he interviewed Che Guevara. In 1968, Vladimir invented a program abolishing censorship, before censorship was abolished by law, of two called Among Us. And he invited on his first program 2 men whose father had been hanged in 1952 during the Slansky trials. One was Rudolf Slansky, one was Jan Schling. What is amazing about this interview was that they were both communists and remained communists despite everything, and they adhered to Marxism. After Vladimir asked them about their experiences. After the interviews, the television studio was flooded with letters of appreciation for having learned so much, which the television viewers had no idea existed, but also flooded with the anti-Semitic letters. What is interesting in 1968, that it was when censorship was abolished, it opened many windows. One of them was fierce anti-Semitism. 1968, of course, ended with the invasion on the 21st of August, and this is one of the famous Josef Koudelska's photograph, When Time Stopped. My mother and Vladimir left Czechoslovakia and were looking for meaningful life, not for money, as other refugees did. And the only way to give their life meaning was to do something for Czechoslovakia that they had abandoned. And that meaning was provided by the journal Listy, which was made in Italy and smuggled to Czechoslovakia. It was made up of articles and ideas and essays written in Czechoslovakia by authors who could not write in Czechoslovakia, smuggled out of Czechoslovakia, turned into a journal Listy, and smuggled back to Czechoslovakia. The journal was terribly important to fortify Czech culture while it was asphyxiated in Czechoslovakia. Jiří Pelikán, a very important intellectual, like many others who worked around the journal Listy, wanted to return to Czechoslovakia in 1989-90, but were prevented, not physically, but nobody wanted here their ideas about restoring democratic socialism. They could return physically, but not otherwise. And certainly not. Havel had no reason to fraternize with people with whom he had disagreed completely during the 1960s and 50s, of course. The book ends with an epilogue where my mother reflects on her life, and here's a photo of 3 weeks before she died. And that's the end of the book.
So Daniela, turn this a little more toward you. As I was saying, I really appreciate being here. I think your book is a wonderful book, and it presents your fascinating family. And it's also a book that, through that family, really opens a window on Czech history, on Czechoslovakia, on everything that's taking place because of your family's travels, many things taking place from the 20s up until the 1990s, but particularly from the 30s to the 90s. So it introduces us to Czech history through their lives. So thanks for that, and also thanks for inviting me here so I could hear your wonderful presentation. It was great, and to see your family members in those photos. I thought I would ask you first. This book, you and I know each other because we're both historians of Mexican communism and the Mexican left, and this book is something completely different. So I was interested in knowing what moved you to write this, because writing something totally different is a challenge. When somebody decides to write a different kind of book, it's a big challenge. So what led you to do that?
I have to say I had to learn a lot, because I really didn't know Czech history to be able to write a book about it. My mother died in 2013, and a colleague of hers wrote an obituary. which was published in The Guardian, and I circulated it among friends and colleagues, and one of them, having read the obituary, said, "Here's a book." It had not occurred to me, and the idea fascinated me. And so I get going, started with archives, because what I realized is that how little I knew. I knew a little bit about my mother and and her feats during the Second World War, which she talked about, but she didn't talk about anything else. And as I started working in the archives, I realized that the subject matter was much larger than my mother, and that I really wanted to write a European history with the methodology of writing through the experiences of its protagonists, rather than any general history. I also wanted, I believe in history, and I wanted to write it in such a way that it spoke to the current generation. I hope it does. That was the other reason for writing it. And I would say that I also wanted my son and my grandchildren to realize where they are also coming from, not only from Mexico, but also from this part of the world, and that they feel some kind of affiliation, attachment to the past of their mother, grandmother, and to the history of Europe.
As I was reading your book, because it's a history of a Czech family, but it's a history of a Jewish Czech family. And as I was reading it, I thought of a novel about a Eastern European Czech family, the great Isaac Bashevis Singer's book, The Family Mascot. And in that wonderful book, sort of there's a family conversation in the middle of the book. And he uses that family conversation to discuss what Jewish Poles at that time thought. And he said, there were three, they say to each other, the family says to each other in conversation, well, we have to stay here and become secular Jews and be good citizens of the country we're in. Or we have to become Zionists and go to Israel, says someone else. And someone else says, no, we have to go to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union will be our protector or homeland, and so on. And so this made me, and you describe your family as secular and as social democratic from the beginning. And so, but I wondered, they're living in a world where those other kinds of choices must have existed, and I wondered how that impacted them, how you thought about that. That is, the various choices Jews had in the 1930s, 1920s really more. But
the research has taught me that Czechoslovakia, particularly Jews, rather than ghettos and pogroms and shtetls, that was not Czech, particularly Czech history. Jews were assimilated, and therefore the choice didn't occur until 1939, when it was apparent that something catastrophic was coming, and that all of them had to make a decision to leave. Other than that, as I keep on saying, that I wouldn't know that I was Jewish if it hadn't been for the Holocaust, and if it hadn't been for the tragic history that is taking place right now in the Middle East.
Yeah, in the book you have I don't remember the sentence exactly, but you pause and you say of your father, Kurt, something like this. Being a Jew wasn't really a big deal to him. It was just who he was, and he wasn't particularly interested in pursuing it. It's my interpretation of what you wrote, but that seemed to me to be the idea. Do you have anything else to say about that while I'm here?
No, that's exactly what he said. That's what I get from the archives, because as you will find out, hopefully, my father didn't say a word about his life before the war, during the war, and after the war, until I became an anthropologist in Chiapas, which he thought was a terrible idea.
It's interesting because I have two stepfathers, both of whom were veterans of World War II, both in the Pacific, and both had terrible experiences. One lost his mind on a gun. He was 17, and the other who was shot in his rear end. And both of them would not really talk about the war. I know those two things, but they never wanted to talk about the war or what happened, which I think was true of many other veterans I've known in the United States. I think maybe that's the common experience, that some of it's too horrible. The one thing that struck me that you mentioned in passing here, you already said this in a way, but I have to say, reading your book, you have these such heroic figures in your book. I mean, Kurt goes on an odyssey, you know, this odyssey down the Danube, and will the ships make it, and what ship are they going to get, and not necessarily under the most noble and wonderful people, and along the way, sometimes people are helpful, but other times people are trying to, and you know, Kurt seems quite heroic figure, and then your mother goes off and joins the RAF, and then at the end of the war, travels across war-torn Europe to get your grandmother, to find her mother, and I just think, I wonder what that, you know, what that does to someone, and you didn't know this, you say.
I didn't know. When we were preparing this conversation, then asked me, were they heroic to you? And I said no, because I didn't know any of it. It was only research that had taught me that they did what they did. Now, had they become heroic to me? Not necessarily. I describe them, and that's what I try to do throughout the book, not to be emotional about any of it. I leave my emotions outside the book, and whether they were heroic or not, it was not something that I dealt with. I did see the point of my mother's becoming emancipated and really empowered, which had characterized all her life. And my father being, I think, my father being the exact opposite. My father's initiatives were diminished. Do I know why? No, I don't. I have never talked about it with him, because he never told me what he did, how he felt during the war and after the war.
And after the war, after the war, both of your parents are communists or become communists. And then shortly after that, Czechoslovakia as a nation becomes communist. And of course, the 40s and 50s are the very intense period of this, because maybe we might say the promises of the initial communist government were not met. And I wonder if you could give us a sense of what it meant for Czechs, for Czechoslovakia, for your family, to suddenly have a communist government in, let's say, in the 1950s.
I'm not going to talk about general Czechoslovak, because that's precisely what I try not to do, not to generalize. But I do talk about the experiences of these individuals. And I claim, or my interpretation is, that after the war, right after the war, to become a communist was the thing to do. Fascism, the war, the Holocaust was so terrible that joining the Communist Party in 1945-46 was a natural way to do. In 1948, and there were not many illusions about what would happen after, but better life, more prosperous life, more just life. And what the government after 1948 showed was the last thing was that it was just. At least it seemed to those people who had suffered during the war the injustice of the previous regime and fell into an injustice, felt living in an unjust regime. My father and mother and a little baby they had wanted to emigrate. They applied for emigration to Australia. It is interesting that they didn't apply for emigration to Israel, created in 1948, because my father had been in Palestine in 1945 and 1946, experienced the violence, and the last country he wanted to emigrate was Israel. He wanted to emigrate to Australia. He did not, they could not, because by the time the permit arrived from Sydney via Paris to Prague, the Czechoslovak government closed the borders. Therefore, if they had any illusions about the system, they lost it there and then.
And so in the course of writing this book, the historical research you did, you learned some very disturbing things about your parents, things that are challenging for you, and I just wondered if you could tell us about those things and how you felt about them, how you still feel about them today, I imagine.
Both Vladimir and my mother were sacked from their jobs, one in 1951, the other in 1950, because they had fought in the imperialist army, that is, with the Allies. After 1948, that was inadmissible. The only army that was praised was, of course, the Soviet army, and they were Jews. Anti-Semitism was had been on the rise. And they both lost their jobs. My mother didn't find, they were both talented linguists, and Vladimir found second-rate jobs in a journal until he joined the Czechoslovak television in 1956. My mother had second-rate jobs until in 1958 she joined the World Federation of Trade Unions, where she had a very good salary and worked as a translator and interpreter. And what is interesting is that on both of them, the Czechoslovak secret police descended and made them work as informants. My mother did it despite herself. That's my interpretation, which not everybody agrees with. And my mother was recruited despite herself, became an informant, reluctant informant, otherwise she would have lost her job, and the archives show that they threatened her, that if she didn't inform, she would have lost her job. I have a different interpretation for Vladimir joining the Secret Service. I think it was Timothy Garton-Ash in the book The File, where he taught us that communists who joined the Stasi in case of Eastern Germany or the Czechoslovak Secret Service communists did it out of conviction. I believe that Vladimir joined the STB out of conviction and collaborated, but found it terribly boring. He was too intelligent to work for them. Both my mother left because she developed stomach cancers, but she also had to renounce her job, which was a terrible blow to her because she became so ill. Vladimir didn't renounce. They dropped him because they were not interested in the rubbish he was providing meaningless information when he provided anything. Did it disturb me? No. It didn't disturb me because I try not to be disturbed by any of it, by any part of the book. I really have written it as a historian, even though in the introduction I say I wrote the book as a daughter, granddaughter, but primarily as a historian. Nothing disturbed me.
I thought your book opens and closes with your mother, your remarkable mother, I will say. And we saw a little bit of her. It was nice to have that video to see her in person, in a sense. And I think it's interesting. The book opens and closes with her. Kurt disappears, really. And the central figure of the center of the book, which deals with Prague Spring, is Vladimir Tosic. And he's such an important and a fascinating character, and he seems to me very contradictory. And you get into that somewhat. Part of his contradictions have to do with his job, his role, his various jobs, also as a secret police agent. But part of it is just in his character. Can you say something about the contradictions that I would say tormented him in the end? I don't know if you would agree with that.
He was tormented morally and intellectually because he was a convinced communist, and the invasion, he was interviewed, I think in England, and he said, "What did the Russians do to us? We love them so much." And he really believed for a long time, and that was his emotional undoing, that the Czechoslovakia was invaded by our brothers, and that he decided to leave Czechoslovakia because otherwise he would have been expelled from his job. He was devastated, and the question is, did he leave the Communist Party? No. He remained a communist till his last days in 1987.
In your book, there's another character who appears here as your parents go to England, go into exile, go to Italy, and that person is Yuri Pelikan. And I thought he seemed a very attractive person. You describe him, a little of his personality, his character. He takes responsibility for this very important journal, Listy, and you talk about the ethos of Listy. It would be interesting for you to talk about him and also about the ethos of Listy.
I think Yuri Pelikan is one of the most extraordinary figure of the era, somebody who was almost a born communist, who fought fascism during the Second World War. He was not Jewish. He was in hiding during the war. Then he became a member party, a high functionary. He had some sins, such as he was part of the expelling of non-communist students from the universities in the 1950s. And later on, he came to his senses and became a director of the Czechoslovak television, and as such did some remarkable opening and talking back to power, which nobody else would have dared. In 1968, he was outspoken against the invasion, and the Russians, when they asked for who should be taken from their posts, Pelikan was one of them. He emigrated to Rome and became this public intellectual, and also a member of the Italian Socialist Party, and as such a member of the European Parliament in the 1970s and early 80s. I think he was a remarkable figure, perhaps now forgotten, who deserves a biography, which I won't write, but should be written by somebody, a remarkable person, magnanimous, and a wonderful, wonderful friend to my parents.
You seem like the logical person to write the book, actually. You know, I mean, you speak all the languages, you already know all the people, and you could, and I think if you brought the same spirit to him that you brought to this, it would be another marvelous book by Daniela. I can't push you, okay.
I think I'd like to go into the state secret police archives and find more about him, because this is one of the concealed history. His entire archive, because he was Italian deputy, he is in Rome, and I went through the archive carefully. It's a treasure trove.
Well, maybe someone here, I don't know if there's a young historian here or an experienced historian, or someone who would want to take that on. In this book, you make it, I wanted to ask a little more about the ethos of Listy. That is, what were these people like as a group? Because it seems to me it has a kind of a group character, a group cohesion.
They were all socialists, former communists, all from the high up in the hierarchy of the Communist Party, of the state, and they did, the reason why they coalesce around the journal, because they had the same ideology. Some had become slightly more to the left or to the right, some were Euro-communists, others were not, but they admired Pelikan. Pelikan was the leader, he was an admirable figure. And what is interesting is that they did it all in their free time, because all of them had to earn their living. And in their free time, they contributed to the journal, made translations from Czech into other languages so that some of the articles could be published in Western newspapers. And one of the things that some of the articles that came out of Czechoslovakia were badly redacted, badly written, or badly overheard on a telephone by people who didn't speak Czech well. So it was a great feat to do the journal, and the journal, I emphasize, helped Czechoslovak culture not to be abandoned, not to fall in disrepute, which it would have. It did, but it would have fallen even lower.
You note that many people outside of Czechoslovakia, in Europe, and in other parts of the world, I would say it myself, in the United States at that time, were hoping that Czechoslovakia would become a democratic socialist society. And yet you write, for 20 years, the group had been advocating democratic socialism when the 1989 revolution swept aside an obsolete political and economic project. I thought that was it was a sort of painful thing to read, actually, that because you present these people with such nobility and courage and constancy, and then you say it's all swept away. And I'd be interested to know why you think that happens. Probably everyone here has some thoughts about why that happens, but why it happens and what that means for Czechoslovakia then.
What it means is what we see today. But more importantly, and without being flippant, what interested me was to see how insensitive these people were to the society that was moving forward, and they had been in touch with their friends and family and colleagues in Czechoslovakia, but they didn't realize that socialism in Czechoslovakia was dead. And it struck me when I was writing the last chapter how unaware they were of the death of socialism in Czechoslovakia. And it meant it was a big disappointment for most of them when in 1989 and 1991 they wanted to return to Czechoslovakia, and Havel told them, "I don't want to have anything to do with you."
You know, I have to say, as an American who was a socialist in the 1960s, who was involved in labor unions here, and who was interested in seeing a socialist party arise here, a social democratic party in America, that neither did we see what was happening. When Ronald Reagan arrived, I think it was equal, you know, it was also the same, but I have that same sense. I'm identifying with what you write about the listy people, the inability to see what's happening around you, to see what's happening to your families, to your coworkers, to the whole country, and to sort of miss that. So it's a remarkable thing. And I have one more question, then I have I don't know the format here, so I'd ask the chair, is there taking questions from the floor or whatever? I don't know. But the other question I have for you is, in writing this book, what did you learn about Daniela Spenser? What did you learn about yourself?
That I can write history, that I can write history books, and that I really wish that I'm not 20 years younger to write another book. I really find difficult to answer that question because it's a book of history. I was not learning about myself. I was hoping, and it didn't happen, to reconcile with my mother, with whom relations were not very good throughout our lives. It didn't happen. It hasn't happened. I learned a great deal about them. It was not a psychoanalysis at all.
Well, I didn't mean necessarily as a psychoanalysis, and I have to say, we already knew you could write history from your other books. So, and I'm sorry to hear you couldn't reach the reconciliation with your mother, which was important to you.
I would like to open the floor to questions from our audience, who I think do have some questions and comments.
Can you explain or kind of interpret the title, the echoes part? And if I recall, I think for the Spanish, maybe it was fragmentos, or so there was another. So what are you getting at with that notion of fragments or echoes?
You historians know that you are not in charge of the titles, and that's the publisher is. So I would like to say that it was not my title.
Well, let me rephrase it then. What are you satisfied with the title? Does the title, come close to what you're trying to suggest? And if not, like, what would be your title? What are you trying to capture?
What my title was: Fragmented Times, Divided Lives in War and Cold Peace. Mm-hmm. That was my title. Mm-hmm. The publisher didn't accept it. Mm-hmm. That's the publisher's. And I hope I won't be mean if I say the publisher wanted to sell, and therefore it had to have exile, mm-hmm. family, Holocaust, and Cold War. It has all the elements for a book to sell.
I guess partly that's not what I expected to hear, but what I guess I was thinking is wondering, as an historian, and as an historian of essentially a biography, to what extent did you feel that in writing a biography, it must be very frustrating, well, you've done it with Lombardo Toledano as well, this idea of trying to get to the whole, to tell the accurate story, but you're always kind of not, you're just grasping at the echoes, right? At the afterlives of these stories. And I wonder if there was a certain, sense of, frustration is not quite the right word, but
it is actually.
Yeah.
It is. Mm-hmm. It is because for Lombardo Toledano, I had 1,300 boxes of his personal life, mm-hmm. right in the center of Mexico City. For here, I had to travel to Rome, to Jerusalem, to Tel Aviv, to Haifa, to the United States, to the Holocaust Museum, of course, to Prague, to many archives in Prague. To some, I was not given access, and to Britain, of course. And it was frustrating because I couldn't get all the information I wanted. I wanted to write a book, a chapter, about education, socialist education in Czechoslovakia in the 1950s and 60s. I thought it would be a very important chapter. However, the Prague City Archive didn't allow me to see the archives of the schools to which I went, saying that the European law, yet the National Archive is fantastic. It allows you to to have access to papers that had been deposited yesterday, which is against the law. But, you know, that's, I say, it's a completely different attitude to archives and to history. And I also think that after so many decades of concealing information, it is an obligation in a country like the Czech Republic to give access. We need to know the history because we know that history is a map for us to move, to understand today, and to move forward, to act in the future. It wasn't. So there is no chapter about education, which would have been frightfully important.
You have a fascinating family history here and a fascinating personal life story from what I've gathered. And as someone who feels like I have 3 hometowns, 2 of which are in this country, where do you feel most at home?
Mexico.
Yeah. You didn't hesitate.
No, I didn't. In part because I've lived there for over 50 years. And in part because I say that I found in Mexico the freedom, the personal freedom, the intellectual freedom that had been denied to me in Czechoslovakia.
I don't know if you want to talk about this, but I couldn't help thinking during your presentation how much you left out about your parents' story, why your parents got divorced, what your relationship with your parents was like. You just told us that your relationship with your mother was problematic. Well, what about with your father, your stepfather, and so on? I just wonder if you would be willing to share some of that with us.
You are not the first one that asked that question to which I don't want to give an answer. No, I will.
Should we let you off the hook?
No, I'm joking. There are several reasons why I don't talk about Vladimir, and that is because he has children and grandchildren in Czechoslovakia and in England. And if I talk to him about him, I could offend other people, and I don't want to do that. Then my mother still has many friends and colleagues from the BBC, and I don't want to badmouth her. And there is a general reason. Had I talked in the book about me, the book would have become a melodrama. And that's exactly what I didn't want the book to become.
If I may ask you two questions. One is I traveled myself with my wife to Prague in 1989. And after the invasion and after they left and so on, we didn't speak Czech. We spoke Spanish, French, and English. We were not well received as being from the Western world. And it's something that impacted me. My family originally, 3 generations back, were Russian, so I still speak a little bit.
Perhaps you spoke Russian.
Yes, well,
well, that explains it.
I could read Czech and sort of understand the meaning, but I couldn't speak Czech. And so we went and asked to have something to eat. I had the bad idea of asking in Russian.
No, that was a very bad idea.
They banged the door against me and so on and kicked us out. The second question is that there were many intellectuals who were sort of on the left side politically for many years. Among them, a famous writer, Milan Kundera, who left and lived in Paris and produced a lot in Paris. He described a lot in some of his books the life in Czechoslovakia during the communist years. What do you think about this?
So the first question has been answered. You don't speak Russian in 1989.
Yes, I know. It was a mistake.
In Czechoslovakia, it was a faux pas. and Milan Kundera. Well, I love his books, but it's a very personal attitude. I don't care that he doesn't, that the way he talks about women. That's not the point. He really analyzes with wit and good prose Czechoslovak history. But as a political figure, he has much to be desired, because he published his books in French when we all believed that we Czechs deserved to read his books first. He was our writer, not French writer as he thought himself to be. So it was a question of translations.
Thank you. So on the topic of languages, since both of your parents were linguists, I have this question, like how important was it for you to speak, let's say, Czech and all these other languages when you did your research? Did it help you? Did it not help you? Because you apparently went through archives in multiple languages. So if you could speak a little bit about that, how much you appreciated that you...
Fundamental. Yeah. I believe that languages are frightfully important, not only for the archives, but for the archives especially. When somebody tells me that he or she did a book about Czechoslovakia and didn't speak or read Czech, I don't believe he or she did a good research. And that's why I appreciate so much that in this country, the historians I have met of Czech Slovak history, they all know the language. So the language was fundamental.
Yeah. Okay. I have a follow-up question, though, which is more of a personal question, but in your family, were you able to preserve Czech? Do your kids speak Czech, their grandkids to any extent? And that's not related to your book, but just curious.
No, it's a shame. It's really a shame on me that I did not. My son was born in 1982, and I spoke to him Czech day and night until he started babbling at me back in Spanish. At that point, I gave up.
Yeah, no, it's hard.
I'm really sorry. And my grandchildren can sing "Já dole sa nepojedu."
Okay, that's nice. No, songs are important in preserving languages.
It is very important. And they do have Czech nationality, Czech citizenship, which is, I praise the Czech Republic for being so generous towards the diaspora, for giving them citizenship, which I think is amazing.
I would like to hear you talk about how this experience, I mean, we've known each other through our professional careers, and I know you as a historian of Mexico more than anything else, but how this experience has allowed you to reflect back on the Mexican state. And, you know, this is a regime that has been called the perfect dictatorship, and not for nothing. And, you know, hearing you reflect about Mexico and the opportunities it offered you, and the freedom to, you know, to be a historian and to inquire. I mean, has this allowed you to somehow revalue Mexico based on, you know, this experience? It seems like you left Czechoslovakia, as many did when the hopes were crushed. In doing this research, you've come, in a sense, to see that it was even maybe worse than you thought it was, the Czech state and the experience. But has this allowed you to view Mexico in a different way and in a maybe less critical way than before you started this project?
I don't think so. I find that the comparison between one and the other is next to impossible, because Czechoslovakia had developed from Czechoslovakia was born in 1918 with an idea of freedom, sovereignty, and that was crushed several times. Mexico had a much more continuous history than that. And I think that has influenced the way the the Czechoslovak state had developed, and the Mexican state, which is much more continuous from the Mexican Revolution to this day. I wouldn't compare them. The completely different societies which make up, as you know better than anyone else, how the society contributes to making the state, and the Czechoslovak society contributed to making the state in one way. The Mexican society contributed to making a completely different state. Do I appreciate Mexico more? I wouldn't know how to answer that question. I appreciate Mexican education much more generous than I would say today in many other countries. I find Mexican is still holding on to the traditions of, today we call it populism, but I think it goes back several decades to the Mexican Revolution, to the 1930s, and the further development to this day. I think there's still a kernel of that popular state which doesn't exist, which is fought against fiercely, I think, even today's Czech Republic.
The part of the history of your family, of your father during World War II, if I understood correctly, he became essentially a British soldier, and then they were taken prisoners of war by Germans and sent as a part of the imprisonment for the forced labor. So did the other soldiers with whom he was taken a prisoner, did they protect his Jewish identity so
Absolutely.
that it would not be revealed, and his treatment sort of would be much harsher in case that would be revealed?
It's a very important question, and I deal with it in the book precisely because there was Red Cross and because there was the Geneva Convention and because laws were respected even by the Nazis. By the Nazis who held the prisoners of war, because of the way the prisoners of war, the British prisoners of war would be treated by the German prisoners of war would be treated by the British. There was a reciprocity. Okay, that's
many prisoners of war of British and American origin who were as maybe generally willingness to present themselves in a better light maybe and follow the laws, but on the other hand there are so many known instances when the British and American prisoners of war, essentially the British or American soldiers, were just shot point blank. There are many documents about that in many European countries, France, and so on. So I guess that...
You know, that's precisely why I don't generalize. Mm-hmm. I shy away from any generalization. I talk about my father's experience, and my father's experience was that he was protected, precisely, he was protected by the British, and the very little he told my mother was that the British would say, they are our Jews.
Thank you. Daniela, at the start you were mentioning one of the reasons behind you deciding to write the book was to write, I guess, about potential lessons or warnings.
About what?
Potential lessons or warnings, in general, from history. What would you highlight as those lessons that you would take from this experience writing the book?
Generosity, friendship. I found that one of the questions I ask myself while researching and writing and crying about my grandmother's story. She remained in Czechoslovakia in 1939, telling my future mother and grandfather, "You go, I'll join you later." And I asked myself, how do you survive Terezín, Auschwitz, Hamburg, and Bergen-Belsen? And I came to the following conclusion, that when my mother found her in Bergen-Belsen, turned into a skeleton, and dignity. My grandmother, who fainted when she saw her daughter, asked her, "Do you have a lipstick? And do you have any civil clothes?" So my interpretation is that dignity was restored people's lives. That's one. And then when my mother arrived, the 19-year-old sergeant in her uniform from the Royal Air Force arrived in Bergen-Belsen. She arrived at not the door, but the entrance to the camp, and she said to the British soldier, "I'm looking for Anna Ornstein. Do you think I could find her?" And he threw up his arms and said, "Oh, don't be ridiculous. People are here who are alive at 1 hour and dead the following hour." There was a girl standing next to the entrance, and said, "Are you Ruth by any chance?" Because she said, "I'm looking for Anna Ornstein." "Are you Ruth Ornstein?" "Yes, I am." "Is your father Wilhelm?" "Yes, he is." "Are you from Prague?" "Yes, we are. Your mother is here." And so that was one anecdote, and there are several anecdotes like these, from which I interpreted that friendship, this girl's friendship with my mother from Terezín all the way to Bergen-Belsen was frightfully important. The choice of jobs, was it serendipitous or was it willful? I think it was not serendipitous. In Terezín, my grandmother worked as a nurse, and in Auschwitz she distributed food. And when the containers were empty, the women who had distributed food could dive inside and scrape whatever was left at the bottom and on the side. So food was, of course, frightfully important. And then languages, back to the languages. The fact that my grandmother spoke Czech and German in Terezín, that is the Lagessprache in Terezín, and that in Auschwitz she spoke Polish, German, Czech, and Yiddish, I say was very important, because the Polish, because the women who were in charge of the camp were Polish prisoners, freed from prisons. And my grandmother could use her skills to communicate in such a way that I don't know whether she gained any privileges, but was better off, I think, than many women. So dignity, friendship, choice of words, choice of jobs, and languages.
Thank you so much.
And luck, I agree. And luck, I agree. Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, if we have no more questions on the top of our heads, let's have one more round of applause for our two speakers.